welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name's Maria and today's video is going to be my reading wrap up for September. So I'm going to be going through all the books I read in September, give you my thoughts, my feelings, my ratings, and basically just go through my reading month with you. So September was actually a really great month for me. When I kind of looked through everything, I ended up with 3 new 5 stars. So a couple of my rereads were 5 stars, but I'm not counting them in the 5 stars that I got this month because I'm rereading them for a reason. I really love them, so they were probably always going to get 5 stars from me. But in terms of new reads, 3 of my new reads were 5 stars. So for me personally, I think that's my best month of reading this year. So I'm really happy with that. So without further ado, let's just get into the wrap up. So the first 3 books I'm going to go through together because this is my reread. So it's the reread of the Throne of Glass series by Sarah J. Maas. So we read Heir of Fire, Assassin's Blade and Queen of Shadows this month, and you can see these are pretty chunky books. I mean, Assassin's Blade is a little bit shorter, but the other 2 are pretty chunky, so I was happy to kind of get through those this month. But yeah, as I say, rereading these, they were all 5-star again. I absolutely love this series, and as much as it does get hyped, I do wish it was hyped as much as ACOTAR is. So I feel like ACOTAR is kind of the star series that everyone talks about from Sarah J. Maas, but for me, I just think this one is so much more intricate. There's so much more world building. There's a lot of foreshadowing in this, and yeah, it's not that I mean, I love ACOTAR. ACOTAR has a very special place in my heart, but for me, this series, technically, objectively, and in terms of plot and characters and everything like that, to me, this one would be the better series of the 2. But that aside, as I say, we read these 3 books. If you haven't heard of Throne of Glass, or at least you may have heard of it, but you don't know what it's about, the first book basically follows our main character, Selin, a Sardothian, who is a slave in an enslavement camp, and one day the Crown Prince comes to kind of take her out of the slave camp because the king is looking for a new assassin, and he thinks that she would be the best candidate for that. She ends up going to the trials in Ardalan, which is the land that this is set in, to participate in these trials to become the king's assassin, and we kind of follow her story from there. And that is really kind of a tiny part of what this series becomes. It really does expand from there, but the first book for me is very introductory. I do think that we get a great introduction to the characters, to the world, to understanding the politics of this land. But as I say, as the books go on, the world expands so much and the world building expands so much that by the end of that series, you really can't believe that it started where it did. So yeah, as I say, read these 3 as a buddy read with some friends on bookstagram. We done a reread last year in preparation for House of Flame and Shadow, so we just decided for fun we would do a reread again this year, hoping that there may be some announcements on ACOTAR 5 or 6, whatever number you want to call it, next year. But I'm imagining it's probably going to be 2026 before we hear about that, so guess we'll just have to do a reread again for that one. But yeah, as I say, reread these and gave them all 5 stars. So next up, I read Lady Midnight by Cassandra Clare, and this is part of the Shadowhunter series, so it is quite a big series. I think this is technically book 10 in the reading order that's kind of recommended for the series, so quite a far way into the series, so I won't be able to give you too much in terms of plotting for this one. But if you haven't heard of the Shadowhunter series, or you're just not sure what it's about, it's basically a mixture of kind of urban fantasy as well as some of the trilogies are more historical fantasy, where we basically follow these group of people who are known as Shadowhunters, who are essentially the protectors of the world, and they protect the mundane world, so the human world, from essentially what is kind of the creatures of the world, so things that you will have heard of before: vampires, werewolves, fairies, all that type of thing. It's basically their job to protect the mundane world from those creatures and to ensure that kind of the laws are upheld and everything like that. And in terms of the main characters, we're following usually young people who are born into this world and are all trained, you know, kind of from birth to be a shadow hunter. So very much that urban fantasy, probably like early 2000s feels. If you like something like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, if you ever watched that, that's definitely the kind of feels I get when I'm reading this one. It is YA, but it doesn't feel YA for most of it. I think the first kind of trilogy is a lot more YA than the following trilogies that I've read. So yeah, you may read the first trilogy, which is the Mortal Instruments, and feel like it is a little bit YA, but for me personally, I'm really glad that I've decided to read on because these later trilogies are definitely worth it and I really love them. So this one is following the first kind of main set of characters who were present in the Mortal Instruments. This is set around 7 or 8 years after the end of that series, so we're kind of reeling from the events that happened within those 2 trilogies, and we're meeting some new characters who are kind of descendants of characters that we've met before within the series, and kind of just following their journey and their story story, and Cassandra Clare is the queen of, if it's forbidden love or love triangles or yearning, or, you know, just that tension between two people who maybe both love each other but they can't tell each other. And honestly, she's done it again, executed it perfectly within this series. I think for most of the series and the trilogies that I've read, there's always been an element of a love triangle or forbidden love or something like that, and you could think that, oh, if it's going to be the same thing within all of the trilogies, does that get a little bit stale? Does it get a little bit boring? And honestly, I have not been bored yet. She's just the queen of writing those situations. Even if you don't like love triangles normally, still give these a try, because I would be the same. I'm not a huge fan of love triangles, but the way that she writes them is, honestly, it's just something else. And I think these don't tend to be kind of considered romantasy in any way, because I do think there is such a rich world building and political landscape in here that a lot of people wouldn't refer to these as romantasy, but there is a huge amount of romance in here. So if you're kind of put off thinking that they're going to be too fantasy led or you're not going to get enough romance in there, that's definitely not the case. A lot of it follows kind of the romances between the main characters and a lot of the side characters as well, so you get plenty of romance in these as well. So if you're interested in it but you weren't too sure because it's not really usually categorized as part of the romantasy side of things, definitely give it a go, because I think you will be satisfied with the amount of romance in here. And needless to say, I gave this one 5 stars. So next up, I read The Temptation of Magic by Megan Scott, and this has kind of been pitted as a dark academia romantasy, and I think that description fits this absolutely perfectly. I think that's exactly what we got when I was reading this. So we basically follow our main character Nicole, who is what is called an Empyrean, or an Imperial, pardon me, an Imperial in this, and essentially that just means that she has kind of supernatural powers, so she could be very strong and deadly. And within this world we have almost like a council who monitor these types of beings, and they're called the Wake. However, Nicole and her family have been hiding from the Wake her entire life because they strongly believe that they were involved in her mother's death. So she's kind of been hiding her powers for quite some time, but she's always wanted to kind of unravel the mystery of her mother's death, and she's trying to do that within this university art department, as she believes a message has been left out from her mother which would kind of open up all of the questions against the Wake, kind of against this organisation, and maybe give them some answers as to what happened to her mother as well. Now, complications arise when Cain, who is an Imperial who is part of the Wake, comes to this little university town on his own hunt, and along the way their paths cross and they decide to kind of reluctantly ally with each other for their own reasons, and the story really does go from there. I thought this was really good. I really did enjoy the writing in this. I thought the prose was quite beautiful as well. I love the author's take on kind of popular folklore, especially the Celtic folklore that I wasn't expecting in here, so that was a nice surprise as well. And I really did like her take on it. I think it added to the richness of the world and the richness of the world building, because it is set in a kind of modern world. It's set in England, in Cornwall, I believe, so it's kind of a standard setting. There's no real world building that needs to be done, but adding that folklore element really did add to that richness for me, and added that fantasy element, which I think really enhanced my experience reading this one. I appreciated that there was a little bit of insta lust in here. It is a romantasy, so there is going to be a little bit of that, but it wasn't pitted as insta love. It was definitely heavily focused on the attraction to that person rather than having big feelings for a person as soon as you've met them. So I did really appreciate that. It wasn't quite a slow burn, but it wasn't an insta love feeling that I got from it. I think the only thing I would say with this one was that I wish the dark academia vibes were a little bit more prominent. I do think that there was an undercurrent of that with the university and the art setting, but other than that there wasn't really a huge dark academia influence on this, so I would have liked that to be a little bit stronger. But as I say, it is pitted as a kind of dark academic romantasy, so a lot of the focus was on the romance and the relationships here, so I kind of let it slide a little bit. But for me overall, I rated this one 4 stars, so I'll definitely be continuing the series with this one, so I'll be excited to see what book 2 has in store. The next book I read was on my Kindle, so it was finishing out a series that I'd read, which is the Mistborn series by Brandon Sanderson. So the last book in that series is The Hero of Ages, and this one was a little bit of a disappointment for me, I must say, because I read The Final Empire quite some time ago. Really loved that book. I thought it was 5 star, you know, a brilliant book, brilliant premise, loved the world building, basically a perfect high fantasy book, so I was really excited to continue the series. Then when I got to the second book, I was a little bit disappointed because a lot of it was filler. You were kind of getting a lot of information about the world, and the pacing was a little bit off for me in comparison to the first one, so I definitely seen a big change there. But I was giving the second book a little bit of leeway because it is a second book, middle book syndrome. I wasn't kind of rating it too harshly, but when I got to the third book I was told, or at least I'd read from a lot of reviews, that the pace did pick up a little bit, but for me unfortunately it didn't. I did feel that it was a little bit stagnant. There was quite a lot of info dumping again. I do think it's to kind of lead on to the rest of the series. There is kind of a second trilogy that is part of this, and I didn't really feel satisfied with the ending. So for me, this one was around a 3 to 3.5 stars. I wasn't completely enamored by it. It's not something that I'm rushing to kind of continue the series with. So yeah, unfortunately it was a little bit of a disappointment for me, but I would say it's a good introductory series for Brandon Sanderson's writing to get an idea of how he writes and the kind of stories he writes, and everyone kind of says this is where you should start. I still think I will kind of read some of his other big series that he has, so The Way of Kings, I think it's the Stormlight Archives perhaps, or I do also have Warbreaker by him as well, which is a standalone. But yeah, unfortunately this series for me, apart from the first book, it kind of fizzled out a little bit, but I will still read from Brandon Sanderson. I do think his writing is good. I think just the plot kind of lost it for me a little bit in this series. So yeah, rated this one 3 to 3.5. So the next book I read was The Secret History by Donna Tartt. Now this is the kind of original dark academia book, and it's one that I've wanted to read for quite some time. So I thought this year I'd get it on the TBR and finally get it checked off that list. And this one, I'm quite conflicted with my rating on this one. I think the rating will stay the same, but in terms of my feelings about the book, I kind of go back and forth in terms of my enjoyment and how much I liked it, how much impact it maybe had on me. But with this one, we're following our main protagonist Richard, who is attending this New England college, and he basically ends up becoming part of this ancient Greek course, which is full of pretentious students. You know, all of the characters within it are basically unlikable, and you get that a lot with dark academia. A lot of the characters are unlikable. You're not supposed to kind of be in love with them as soon as you meet them. They're usually quite morally grey, and we definitely got that delivered with this one. They have an eccentric teacher who is kind of not wanting other teachers to have an influence on them, so it's almost like a secret society within this college. It's very elite. They feel as if they are quite elite in terms of the other students within the school, so you're getting all of that pretentious kind of feeling when you're reading this one. And I think the setting in a New England college definitely gave me that autumnal feel and really helped enhance my experience in terms of the atmosphere that we were setting in this one. And basically we start off the story with a murder of one of the friends within this group, and it's kind of going through the process of how we got there, how the murder occurred, why it occurred, and it goes into some really dark themes as we go along with these characters. And I would certainly say for this one, check up some trigger warnings before you read it, because there's quite a lot of things that I kind of found quite jarring. I know it was written in 1991 or 2 or something like that, but for me there was quite a lot of homophobia in here, a lot of misogynistic views. There was racial slurs used in here for a reason unknown. You know, I'm not really sure what it added to the story. I know it may have been of its time, but I think the 90s was far enough where there didn't need to be as much in here in the way that it was being used. And as I say, in terms of the homophobia and, you know, prejudice against the LGBTQ society, I felt like sometimes the sexualization of that was almost used to villainize some of those characters. And yeah, so I definitely say just check up some triggers. I think there's a lot of problematic maybe views in here and viewpoints in here, and again, that's part of the reason I'm a little bit conflicted about it, because on the other hand, I really thought the prose in here was absolutely beautiful. The way that she described certain scenes and environments, I really felt like I was there. It really built the atmosphere for me. I ended up tabbing it because there were so many quotes and prose that I just really wanted to remember and take note of. So I think it was an incredibly well written book. I think the structure of it was good. It was a little bit slow at the end, I will say. It kind of lost momentum for me, but overall I thought the story was really good, and I do think that it kind of delivered on what it promised to deliver. A very dark story with kind of no redemption for the characters at the end. You will not like the characters at the end, or I imagine most people won't like the characters at the end of this. So yeah, a little conflicted with this one. I did rate it 4 stars because I do think that the writing and objectively this is a really well written book. I thought prose were beautiful, but in terms of how the story went and in terms of the things explored in here, I'm still a little conflicted with this one, but I ended up rating it 4 stars overall. So next up, I read The Dragon Republic by R.F. Kuang, and this is the second book in the Poppy War series. So I read the Poppy War a couple of months ago, maybe. I can't remember exactly how long ago it was, and it was with my friend Tiffanys, so I'll link her bookstagram down below. But we done a buddy read for Poppy War, and we have buddy read the second one now, so we just need to read the third one to finish out this series. But this one, I think, was more of the same of what we got in book 1. I think there was an expansion of the world that we got there, a lot of character development, a lot of character exploration, and honestly just a lot of heartbreak in this one as well. It's truly amazing how R.F. Kuang can make me feel so viscerally what these characters are going through. I think she writes about war in a really realistic way. I think I've read a lot of things with stories including war and including kind of that hardship, but there's almost like an air of hope throughout it, whereas with this I do feel like at most times you're kind of feeling hopeless, and I do think that within real wartime situations that probably is how characters will be feeling or how people will be feeling, and I think she really does represent that very well in here, while also sprinkling in some comic relief with some of the side characters and the banter that they have, because again, human nature, certainly where I live anyway, is in really hard times, you know, you're still going to have banter with your friends, you're still going to try and keep everybody happy, keep everybody, you know, motivated and keep the mood lifted, even when it is a really dire situation. So I think R.F. Kuang really encapsulates that perfectly within this book. And I ended up rating this one 5 stars as well, because the first book was a 5-star for me and this felt exactly the same. I just don't think I could have rated it any lower than that. But if you haven't heard of this series, basically the Poppy War starts out with our main protagonist Rin, who is from quite an abusive home. She's living with her aunt and uncle. She was an orphan quite young, and they basically treated her like a slave for her entire life. And the story starts out when she's 14 and she's about to get sold off for marriage to quite an old man, but she makes a deal with her aunt and uncle that if she can get into this military training school called Synagard, that they will allow her to go there rather than getting married. So she ends up getting in and she starts training and unlocking some powers that she wasn't aware that she had, and the story kind of goes from there, and it really just delves into themes of grief, of loss, of morality. You know, when you're in war, who's right? Is there ever a right side? Do both people have kind of reasons to morally be right? And yeah, it just leaves you asking a lot of questions on your own morality and how you would deal with these situations. And the characters in here are not perfect, they're not making the perfect decisions. There's not an easy moral decision either, and yeah, there's at times you're kind of really wondering why the characters would do such a thing or how they could do such a thing. But again, I think it all just ties back to the really true and visceral representation of what wartime and war is like. And yeah, as I say, absolutely 5 stars for this one. I can't wait to read the third book. So next up, I read The Nightingale by Kristen Hanna, and this was actually a book club book that I read with my mum, my sisters, and my niece is part of the book club, but she didn't read this book yet. She's joined a little bit later, but this was our first book club book pick for the month of September. So we decided to pick this one because it's quite a well-known book. A lot of us did want to read it, so we thought it would be the perfect book to start out with, and it definitely was. It was a really good read. This is the first Kristen Hanna book I've ever read, so I was really excited to see what her writing style was like and kind of her storytelling was like, because she seems to be really well loved by people who seem to like all different genres, seem to really enjoy her writing. So I was really intrigued to see how this one turned out. In this one, we follow 2 sisters who are in the midst of the Nazi occupation of France in World War II. It's kind of starting out from the beginning of that occupation, and one of the sisters, Fianne, is kind of the older sister. She's a lot more quiet in her approach to things. She's just wanting to try and get by and survive. She has a young daughter that she has to look after. Her husband is off to war and she's just trying to get by and kind of survive this time as peacefully as she can. Her younger sister Isabel is a bit more of a wildfire, and she's a bit more passionate about her feelings about the Nazis and kind of what they're making the French do. And for a lot of the book, those two are at kind of loggerheads at their approach about things, but the story kind of follows their journey throughout this harrowing time. And I knew going into this that it would be an emotional read, just given the time period that this is covering and kind of the events that I knew would probably be brought up in here. But I didn't expect to viscerally feel the emotions as much as I did with this one, and I think Kristen Hanna's writing was really effective in doing that and making me really feel what the characters were going through. I think she really massively put me right there in their shoes. I really felt like these things were happening to me as well, and I think she just wrote it really, really well. And I just loved that it was highlighting maybe some of the forgotten stories that we may not hear about World War II. I don't know if this is following a true story or anything like that, but there's bound to be, you know, hundreds of unsung heroes who were just normal people, ordinary people, just going about their days trying to survive, but also in the midst of war, trying to save people, you know, within these little towns and these villages. And some of these will have been women, there will have been men that were left behind as well, but a lot of these will be stories of the women of World War II. And yeah, I just love the way she highlighted that, and I thought it was a really important message to bring, because again, it's stories that we may not hear as often. There were a few things that brought me out of the story a little bit, which is why it wasn't a 5-star for me. It did end up being a 4-star, but some of the rhetoric that the characters were using were a little bit modern for me, and I do think that it didn't really fit in with that kind of time period, and especially in the French village that they're living in, it just didn't really sit as nicely within the story for me. There was also kind of a forbidden lust storyline, which I don't think really added anything to the story, and I don't think it was really necessary. So again, it kind of took me out of the story a little bit, because for me personally, it just wasn't really necessary. But other than that, as I say, it was really well written. I thought the way that she described everything and kind of highlighted everything was really masterfully done. So yeah, this definitely won't be the last Kristen Hanna one I read, and I ended up rating it 4 stars overall. And then the last one, ending on a high note for this one, was Out on a Limb by Hannah Bonham Young, and I absolutely loved this. I really enjoyed this. Basically read it in a day, couldn't put it down. I just wanted to see where the story went with this one. And it's interesting because this is basically a book surrounding a trope that I usually would avoid or wouldn't look for, and it's accidental pregnancy. That's not a spoiler, it is on the back and in the synopsis, but I do think that the author had quite a unique spin on this. So this one starts out with our main character Wynne, who is a very independent person. She's always been that way, and a lot of it has to do with her disability. So she has a difference in her limb, so she has quite a small hand. So essentially she has been disabled for her entire life, and a lot of her strength is in that she doesn't want to be coddled. She doesn't want people to do things for her. She wants to be independent and to do things for herself. And basically Wynne is at a Halloween party at her best friend's house. Her and her best friend grew up together. They're almost like sisters. Their mums were pregnant around the same time, very young, ended up living together, so they basically grew up as sisters. But she's at her best friend's house for Halloween and ends up having a one night stand with this man who is incredibly charming, incredibly charismatic, and he actually also does have a disability, as one of his legs have been amputated, so he has prosthetic legs. So there was a lot of disability representation in here, but the way that it was done, it wasn't just kind of put in there to have disability representation. It was definitely done in such a masterful way, and I think a lot of that has to do with the main character actually has the same condition as the author of the book, so she obviously has quite an intimate knowledge and understanding of how this disability impacts someone and how it can kind of shape you. And we basically follow the story along with Wynne and Beau, because Wynne gets pregnant and it's kind of following their journey and dealing with that, their worries about that, how their kind of relationship may change. And I just really love the writing in this. I love the banter between the characters. I love the friendship in it. I love the relationship with the male main character. I just thought it was a really healthy representation of what should happen if the situation happens in real life. I just thought it was really refreshing the way that it was told, and I ended up giving this 5 stars because I absolutely loved it. Loved the relationship, loved the story, loved the representation in here, and yeah, couldn't put it down, so I couldn't give it anything less than 5 stars. And that's everything. So as I say, I had a really great month of reading, had 3 5-stars. I don't think I've had that the rest of this year, so really excited about that, really happy with that as well. And I do think this time of year I tend to read a lot more books that end up being really impactful for me, so that may have something to do with it. It may just be this time of year I enjoy reading more, but definitely really happy with getting 3 5-stars within 1 month. Let me know what your favourite read of September was, if there's anything you think I should be getting on my autumn TBR. It is pretty stacked as it is, but I'm always down for any recommendations for things to read around this time of year, so definitely let me know any of your recommendations down below. If you like this video, do remember to give it a like, and if you want to see more from me, remember to subscribe. I'm posting 2 videos per week, and it will be videos like this, so my wrap-ups, my book shopping, my hauls, all good bookish things like that. Other than that, thanks so much for watching this one. I hope you really enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one soon. Bye!